In 1839, an American traveler named John Lloyd Stevens hacked his way through the jungle of what is now Honduras and stumbled into a plaza that stopped him cold. Stone pyramids rose 60-70 feet through the canopy, their staircases still climbable, their surfaces covered in carved hieroglyphs no living person could read. Stelae, massive stone monuments carved with the faces of kings, stood half swallowed by roots, staring out at a city with no people in it. Stevens wrote that he felt as though he'd found the ruins of a civilization that had risen to greatness, flourished, and decayed. And he had no idea, standing there, that the answer to what happened would take modern science almost 200 years to even begin to piece together. That city was Copán. It was one of dozens like it, and the mystery Stevens walked into that day, the mystery of why the Maya vanished, turns out to be built on a foundation that's mostly wrong. The Maya didn't vanish. Millions of their direct descendants live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras today, speaking Mayan languages, in many cases within sight of the very ruins tourists photograph. What actually happened between roughly 800 and 950 AD is something much stranger and, in its way, much more disturbing than disappearance. A catastrophic, cascading collapse of political and urban civilization across an entire region, in which the cities emptied out while a huge number of the people who'd built them didn't leave. They starved in place in a landscape of pyramids that had stopped being able to feed them. If real, documented mysteries from deep history are why you're here, subscribe and turn on notification. We go looking for the next one every week. To understand how strange this collapse is, you first have to understand what the classic Maya world actually was at its height, because it wasn't the simple, remote culture that spent much of the 20th century in the popular imagination. Between roughly 250 and 800 AD, the Maya built one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in the ancient world, entirely within tropical lowland jungle, a setting that on paper should have made large cities nearly impossible to sustain. They developed the only fully developed writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a system so precise it recorded exact dates, royal genealogies, wars, and astronomical events. They developed a calendar system of extraordinary mathematical sophistication, capable of tracking cycles spanning thousands of years, alongside an independently invented concept of 0 centuries before it reached Europe. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that modern researchers, checking the numbers against real orbital mechanics, have found to be remarkably precise. And they built cities on a scale archaeology took decades to fully appreciate, largely because jungle canopy hid so much of it. Tikal, in modern Guatemala, had temple pyramids reaching over 200 feet, rivaling structures anywhere in the ancient world. Recent LIDAR survey, laser mapping flown over the jungle by aircraft, capable of digitally stripping away millions of trees to reveal the ground beneath, have shown that what archaeologists once assumed were isolated ceremonial centers were part of vast interconnected urban and agricultural landscapes, causeways connecting cities across miles of terrain, intensive terracing and canal systems, reservoirs engineered for the dry season, residential zones stretching far beyond any city's core. A 2018 LIDAR survey across roughly 2,100 square kilometers of northern Guatemala identified over 60,000 previously unmapped structures, suggesting the Maya lowlands supported a population plausibly between 7 and 11 million people at the civilization's height, a landscape most textbooks had described as sparse jungle. This was not a culture in decline stumbling toward an inevitable end. At its peak, in the 8th century, the classic Maya world was arguably as densely populated and as architecturally ambitious as anywhere on Earth. And then, within roughly a century and a half, the central and southern lowlands, the heartland of classic Maya civilization, cities like Tikal, Copán, Calakmul, Palenque, went from their maximum extent to near-total political and demographic collapse. The archaeological signature of this collapse is unmistakable. Maya cities recorded their history on carved stone monuments called stelae, each typically commissioned to mark a king's reign, a date, an event, following the precise long-count calendar. For centuries, these were erected constantly, city after city, an unbroken stream of dated monuments. And then, city by city, the dates simply stop. Copán's last dated monument is from 822 AD. At Tikal, monumental construction and dated inscriptions trail off through the early 800s. Site after site shows the same pattern. A final dated stela, then silent. This is, on its own, one of the most precisely dated collapses in all of ancient history, because the Maya effectively left behind their own death certificates. Carved in stone, each one telling archaeologists almost exactly when a particular city's political and ceremonial life ended. But the stelae only tell you when kings stopped being recorded. What happened to everyone else comes from a different kind of evidence, and it's here the story turns genuinely grim. Population estimates from careful archaeological survey, house mounds, construction phases, burial density suggest population across the southern lowlands dropped by 80 to 95% within roughly a century of the collapse beginning. Skeletal remains from this period at multiple sites show a documented spike in markers of malnutrition, porotic hyperostosis, a pitting of the skull bone associated with chronic childhood anemia found at significantly elevated rates in burials from the collapse period compared to earlier centuries. People did not simply leave the city. In many documented cases, they stayed, and their bones show they were slowly starving while they did. So what actually caused it? This is where serious Maya archaeology has converged over the last few decades on an answer that's uncomfortable precisely because it isn't a single dramatic cause. It's several converging pressures that fed into each other, each one making the others worse, in a way that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone paying attention to how complex systems fail in the modern world. The first and most heavily weighted factor in recent research is drought, and this isn't speculation from ambiguous evidence. It comes from some of the most rigorous paleoclimate data available anywhere in the Americas. Researchers have extracted sediment cores from lakes across the Yucatan Peninsula, including a well-studied core from Lake Chichén Itzá, using oxygen isotope ratios trapped in layered sediment to reconstruct rainfall going back thousands of years. That data shows severe multi-year droughts clustering in exactly the collapse period, with some studies estimating rainfall reductions of 40 to 70% below normal during the driest interval, among the most severe droughts in the entire regional climate record. Cave formations called speleothems, stalagmites growing in layers that reflect groundwater mineral content, have independently corroborated this at multiple sites, giving two separate lines of evidence pointing to the same pattern landing squarely on the collapse period. Here's what makes that drought catastrophic rather than merely difficult. The Maya lowlands have almost no permanent rivers or lakes across large portions of the territory. Classic Maya civilization had engineered its way around this brilliantly, building enormous reservoirs. Tikal alone had reservoir capacity estimated in the hundreds of millions of gallons, fed by paved catchment surfaces funneling seasonal rain into storage. But it was a solution built for the rainfall patterns of previous centuries, with a hard ceiling. When successive drought years pushed rainfall far enough below that baseline, no engineering could compensate because there was no river or lake to fall back on. A civilization that had brilliantly adapted to a semi-arid environment found the climate shifting to a drier baseline than any of its infrastructure had been built to survive. Deforestation almost certainly made this worse, and this part is directly measurable in the sediment record too. Maya agriculture and construction required enormous quantities of wood, both for fuel and for producing lime plaster, which coated nearly every temple and plaza across the classic Maya world and required intensely wood-fueled kilns to produce at scale. Pollen records from lake sediment cores show dramatic, sustained forest clearance accelerating through the late Classic period, exactly as population and construction peaked. Modern climate modeling applied to this deforestation pattern suggests large-scale forest removal would have measurably reduced local rainfall and increased regional temperatures on its own, meaning the civilization's own growth may have been quietly worsening the exact conditions that would eventually help destroy it. A feedback loop closing in slow motion, invisible to anyone living through any single decade. Then there's warfare, a part of the story older, more romanticized views of the Maya badly underestimate, largely because for most of the 20th century, Maya hieroglyphs hadn't yet been deciphered. Once epigraphers cracked the script, the stelae and inscriptions once read as purely ceremonial turned out to record something bloodier, a late classic political landscape defined by escalating warfare between rival dynasties, particularly a decades-long rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul that pulled dozens of smaller cities into shifting alliances and proxy conflict. As drought pressure mounted and agricultural surplus shrank, warfare intensified rather than easing. A documented pattern at several sites of increasingly militarized architecture, fortification walls hastily added to previously open ceremonial cities, and inscriptions recording a rising conflict in the decades immediately preceding each site's final dated monument. Competition among rival dynasties for shrinking resources looks in the record less like a cause of the collapse and more like an accelerant thrown onto a fire drought had already lit. And underneath both the drought and the warfare sits a third, quieter pressure that some researchers argue made the whole system brittle in the first place. A political structure built around divine kingship and prestige competition that incentivized exactly the wrong response to environmental stress. Maya kings derived their legitimacy substantially from their ability to commission massive temples, sponsor elaborate rituals, and demonstrate favor with the gods, particularly rain gods, whose goodwill kings claimed personal responsibility for securing. When droughts hit, the documented response at multiple sites wasn't a scaling back of resource-intensive elite activity. It was, if anything, an intensification of temple construction and ritual expenditure, an attempt to outbuild and outritual a crisis that stone and ceremony could not actually solve. Resources that a purely pragmatic response might have redirected toward agricultural resilience were, in a system where a king's authority depended on visible religious success, poured instead into exactly the kind of monumental construction that shows up so dramatically in the archaeological record and so little in anyone's ability to actually eat. Put these together and you get something that modern researchers increasingly describe not as one collapse with one cause, but as a cascading systems failure, remarkably similar in structure, though centuries earlier and independently arrived at, to the very different Late Bronze Age collapse across the Mediterranean. Severe drought reduced agricultural yield below what an already dense population required. Elite political competition, structurally unable to respond to that stress with anything but more of the costly behavior that had caused it, escalated into warfare precisely when the population could least absorb the disruption. Deforestation, driven by centuries of the civilization's own success, had already quietly degraded the local climate's capacity to recover. And a political ideology that tied a king's legitimacy to displays of extravagance rather than practical governance meant the system had almost no mechanism for de-escalating gracefully. Each stress made the others worse, and by the time any single ruler might have recognized the full scope of the problem, the tools available to him, more temples, more rituals, more war against a rival dynasty facing the identical crisis, were exactly the tools that had helped create it. It's critical to say clearly what this collapse was not, because the popular imagination has gotten this wrong for nearly 2 centuries. It was not the end of the Maya people. It was not even the end of Maya civilization as a whole. It was specifically the collapse of the classic period political and urban system concentrated in the southern lowland. Maya cities in the northern Yucatan, including Chichén Itzá, actually rose to new prominence in the centuries immediately following the southern collapse, adapting to drier conditions with different water management strategies and different political structures. Millions of Maya people survived, adapted, and continued in smaller settlements, different economic patterns, and eventually entirely new political centers, right through the Spanish conquest centuries later and into the present day. Roughly 7 million people who identify as Maya live across Mexico and Central America today, many speaking one of over 20 surviving Mayan languages, in a direct, unbroken cultural lineage stretching back to the civilization that built Tikal and Copán. What actually vanished was a specific system, a network of rival divine king, a particular model of monumental urban political life, concentrated in a particular ecological zone that could no longer support it once the climate and the politics turned against each other at the same time. The pyramids didn't get abandoned because the people who built them disappeared into myth. In a great many documented cases, the people who built them, or their children, or their grandchildren, kept living in the shadow of those pyramids for generations afterwards, in progressively smaller numbers, farming smaller plots, watching plazas that had once held tens of thousands of people for royal ceremonies slowly get reclaimed by exactly the jungle their ancestors had cleared to build them in the first place. Which brings the story back to John Lloyd Stephens, standing in that plaza at Copán in 1839, looking at stelae carved with the faces of kings whose names he couldn't read, in a city with no people in it, and guessing, correctly as it turns out, though he had no way to prove it yet, that he was looking at greatness that had genuinely flourished before it decayed. What nearly 2 centuries of archaeology, epigraphy, LIDAR mapping, and isotope analysis since then have added isn't a different ending. It's the mechanism, a precise, richly documented picture of exactly how a civilization sophisticated enough to track Venus's orbit and invent the mathematical concept of zero could still be brought down by drought, deforestation, and kings who kept building temples to a rain god who had stopped answering. The forest that swallowed those cities is still growing over new discoveries today. LIDAR surveys across the Maya lowlands continue to reveal structures no one knew existed, entire settlement networks hidden under jungle canopy that satellite imagery alone still can't fully penetrate. Every few years, another patch of forest gets stripped away digitally, and another piece of the population estimate, the road network, the irrigation system, gets added to a picture that keeps getting larger and more sophisticated the more carefully anyone looks. The civilization is not lost. It was never lost. It was simply waiting under 200 years of jungle regrowth on top of the 800 years since the last king stopped being able to answer for the rain, for the technology to exist that could finally see it clearly.